Bob Mattingly is the Executive Director of the Center for Spiritual and Ethical Education, or CSEE. The association assists 370 independent schools from around the country with professional development on subjects such as academic integrity, service learning, and character education. Before coming to CSEE, he was the Director of Accreditation at the Association of Independent Schools of Maryland, or the DC Schools. Prior to that, he worked in various independent schools as the head of the school, as admissions director and teacher. He has a master's degree in administration from Harvard, a master's of divinity and master's of theology from Boston College, and a master's of philosophy from Loyola University, Chicago. Please join me in warmly welcoming Mr. Mattingly to Taft.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here with you here this morning. I was very excited to get this invitation to speak with you here this morning for your chapel service. But one of the things that occurred to me as I got the invitation is, why do we do chapel at independent schools? I was one of those annoying kids in school that always asked the question why, as opposed to just accepting things on face value. So to kind of think about this may or may not still be called chapel, but it has its origins in that idea of chapel, this idea of bringing the community together in this way. So again, it leads me to ask the question, why do we gather in this way for independent schools? It used to be that it was a highly religious gathering, but that has kind of faded a bit over time. So again, to ask, why are each of you here? Maybe because it's a requirement, maybe because you have to be and you'd be in trouble if you weren't. Maybe at some schools they do it out of school spirit where it's optional. Some people do it because they really want to please the chaplain. But if you think about that, even if you do believe in God and you come to chapel or religious worship, what does that exactly mean? If you kind of think about that and deconstruct it a little bit. Does God somehow need people to gather to worship God? Probably not. If we believe that God is pretty good by himself, then there probably is not a need for humans to sing, burn incense, pray, or do ritual. Some people point to gatherings, religious worship, as a way to get what they need. That kind of help where you're really panicked about an exam or maybe an illness of a family member. But again, if we think about that, that also has some intrinsic problems with it. What does that say about God if the divine is what we claim the divine to be? When you pray, are you letting the divine know something that wasn't already known? All religions hold that the divine is somehow omniscient and omnipresent, all those things, that the divine already knows what's going on. So we're not filling God in on anything. God wasn't ignorant of what was going on in the world. Then is it somehow this weirdness where God will only help us if we beg? I'm not sure that works either. That's not quite a picture of a divine that works very well either, that this notion that we must somehow beg in order to get something done. And further, if you do pray and it doesn't happen, does that mean that you did it wrong or there's something wrong with you? None of these typical reasons for worship gathering make sense at first blush. You have to gather a little deeper. You are here maybe because you have to, But if you think about it, in working with schools all over the country, one of the most valuable things schools have is time. At many school meetings, one of the biggest fights is who gets time to do what. We want to include this in the curriculum. We want to include this in the day. And there is always tension, argument around who gets how much time to do what. But yet Taft has said that this is a valuable experience for this kind of community gathering. So there must be something to it. And not only you here, this is true at schools and in cultures and in groups all over the world. Virtually all studied cultures around the world have some kind of group gathering over the centuries. Why is that? There must be something to gathering in a group and doing this kind of activity that is valuable. Anthropologists and sociologists and other people who have looked at this have kind of looked back at the origins. And whereas if you look, say, at a religious worship, it has often all sorts of bells and whistles and art and beauty. If you look back at why they started, researchers say that there is one common thing. No matter what religion, no matter what culture, where you are in the world, that this gathering of groups in worship and this or gathering of groups in kind of community support is in response to adversity, to challenge. At some point, each person, group, culture hits a brick wall. Disease, famine, war, sickness. There are those moments in which you can't go it alone. You can't seem to progress further. People come to understand that the human person is not designed to function alone. It's sort of like a cell phone. A cell phone needs to be plugged in every now and then. It can't function totally by itself. The human person, in the same way, cannot function totally alone. The human person needs to be connected. It needs to be connected with others in a state of humility and a desire for peace. And in this connection, the human person grows in strength, and it expands from a sense of one to a sense of community. We see this in all sorts of ways. Look at a sports team. What's more annoying than a basketball team where you have a player who isn't passing the ball, who isn't functioning as a team, or any number of sports, or whether we're talking about a job or a group activity or even love? The human person is designed to reach out to other people. The human person is not designed to be totally alone. The human person is designed to be in groups like this, where the human person learns how to grow in mutuality and to grow stronger. This means that the human person needs to be able to do two things. One kind of makes sense to us, and we hear this a lot. One is to learn how to give. We hear that a lot in the virtue of community service and all of those kinds of things. Often, though, I think for people in the independent school world, the harder element is to learn to receive. How do we draw strength from each other when we're challenged, when we're afraid, when we're hurt? Sometimes people who get into independent schools tend to be go-getters, they tend to be overachievers, all of those kinds of things, and it's a little hard for us to be vulnerable. It's a little hard for us at times to reach out to gather strength from other people. This isn't simply something created in my head. Another way to describe this is spirituality. There's two ways to understand spirituality. The most popular and common way is what I talked about in terms of a religious spirituality, but there's also what is called a secular spirituality. Spirituality is simply the ability to reach out and to give and to gain from something else, whether that's a person, the environment, all sorts of things. But this stance in life in which you give and you receive. And again, this isn't something simply in my head, but research points to this as true. There has been great research at Columbia University in New York, Florida State, Johns Hopkins, Pew researchers, and others that have looked at spirituality. And they have taken, not to get too deep into the research and bore you, but hopefully I'm not boring you already. But they have looked at spirituality and they've looked at religion. Spirituality is that which I'm talking about, this ability to give and receive from others, from your environment, from all of those things around you. The other is religion, which is worship, whether you're a Christian, Jewish, a Buddhist, whatever that may be. So the practice of a religion. And they have broken people into 4 categories. Those who are spiritual and religious, those who are spiritual and not religious, those who are religious but not spiritual, and those who are neither religious or spiritual. And what they have found at all of these universities is that having simply religion without any spirituality doesn't get you very far. But if you have spirituality and religion, or just spirituality by itself, that leads to all sorts of human healthiness. Whether we're talking about physical health, people have lower blood pressure, all of that kind of things that researchers can study easily, mental health, and behavior. Columbia University looked at spirituality among young children and the K through 8 world. And kids did better in school, they had healthier lives in all sorts of ways. So this spirituality, what does that mean? It means that we're made that way. That we are made in a certain way. Just as the iPhone needs to be plugged in, the human person needs to be plugged in to something beyond itself. I saw this also when I was working at the University of Pennsylvania. I was doing a graduate program there, and I was working with a family. I was working at the University of Pennsylvania Hospital. And I worked with people who were dying, and primarily I worked with their families. And there was a family, their loved one was dying, and they'd come in from far and wide. They all really hated each other. They had a turbulent family, and it was just a mess. This is just one of many families like that. But in being together with each other as their father, their brother, etc., died, over time, they learned to depend on each other. Over those 2 weeks, they learned how to support each other. They learned how to accept the death of their loved one. That was a kind of spirituality that they put into practice, and they were much healthier people at the end of it, albeit the irony of experiencing the death of father, brother, husband, than they were when they arrived. So what is this gathering then? I see this gathering, no matter whether you call this a community gathering, a chapel, whatever you call it here, but I see these all over the place in the independent school. I tend to think of them as a laboratory, as a classroom. It's a classroom to learn how to be with others, how to grow in comfort with ourselves, with our environment. For some of you, it may be an opportunity to learn how to connect with the divine. It's a place where we learn not only how to give, but to receive. My hope for all of you is that throughout your life, you will find gatherings like this, find places and groups that give you both the time and space to be who you are, to draw strength from others, and to be strength for other people. Thank you.